2 months ago, I did a very short lens review. Truly, it was less than 10 minutes on Sigma's 28 to 70mm f2.8 mounted on Panasonic's Lumix S5. I was so taken by the combined size, weight, and performance of this package, smaller and lighter than our GH5 kit, with better autofocus, better color, better high ISO performance, shallower depth of field possibilities, that I wondered if it was finally time to sell our GH5, finally time to exit Micro Four Thirds. And then I promptly forgot about it, until I didn't. Hey everybody, I'm Hugh Brownstone for Three Blind Men and an Elephant. And today I want to share with you a real-world gear buying decision process, beginning with whether or not to sell our GH5. But before I do, I want to thank the folks at Storyblocks for making this episode possible. Storyblocks is a one-stop shop for stock video footage, effects, images, and more, with royalty-free, subscription-based, accessibly priced, unlimited downloads. We use Storyblocks with turnaround times and low, predictable costs that were unimaginable just a few years ago for channels and small production firms like ours, or yours. If you're a video creator with an ambitious vision for a project, a one-man band, a small agency, or a production company, leveraging the reach and skill of people around the world through existing assets that they've created is the way to achieve that vision in the shortest, most cost-effective time frame possible. No worries about monetization or copyright issues. Whatever your project, stock footage, stock music, stock effects can become key. To learn more, visit them at storyblocks.com/Hugh. Thanks, Storyblocks. Okay, I'll cut to the chase for those of you who don't want to stick around for what I consider the important stuff. That is a fairly detailed blow-by-blow recounting of how I thought it through and how that might help you in your own buying decisions, irrespective of what kind of gear you're considering. And instead, just want to know the punchline, which is this. Even after 4 years, even after the frenzied waters of the last 3 years around full-frame cameras, even after the craziness of these last 12 months, even after being impressed by the Lumix S5 in particular these past few months, no, it is not time to sell our GH5. It's simply too well-rounded, too reliable, too functional, too good a value for what we do, with glass too good, too compact, and too keenly priced. A Micro Four Thirds format still too full of potential. And the full-frame market still too full of potential, too far from being realized at anywhere near the price, size, or weight of what we already have for me to jump ship. 8K might change that. But in any event, I do need to make some changes, and I am getting impatient. Maybe you can relate. GAS, gear acquisition syndrome, can be an insidious thing. In fact, in the first draft of this script, I wrote, the question about whether or not I should sell our GH5 did not begin with a preoccupation over any particular new camera or other piece of gear, but instead from the opposite end. I knew precisely what our GH5 and the G9 couldn't do for us, and I recognized precisely how this was costing us time, money, and stress. 3 things that hadn't bothered me before the pandemic hit, all of which had as their source the same issue, the lack of highly performant autofocus, specifically video autofocus. But you now know that the, oh, there was no shiny thing disclaimer was dead wrong. I just hadn't figured it out at the time. The first step in recovering from gas is acknowledging it. So, yes, that S5 Sigma 28 to 70 combo did start me thinking we could leave our go-to setup for much of the past 4 years, our GH5 with a Leica DG Vario Summilux 10-25 1.7, which, by the way, is one of my favorite lenses of all time, and standardize instead on a single lens mount across our personal and professional work, stills and video, APS-C, and full frame. It was an appealing thought, a shared lens portfolio for the two of us because Claudia and I have standardized on the L mount for our personal work already. Let me provide context and dive into the details, because in them, you may find that you've been going through similar practical considerations, thought experiment gyrations, rationalizations. Though sometimes it's not rationalization. Back in 2017, the day it became available, March 30th, I remember it well, I standardized on the GH5 as our A-cam for all of our professional work, video and photography, as well as for my personal work. We bought it because we'd committed to producing a social impact documentary about the Mariner East Hazardous Liquids Pipeline Project, which would eventually turn into a 25-plus webisode series based on dozens of long-form interviews, some lasting more than 2 hours. I'll put a link to it down in the description below. I learned a lot during that. Sony, the system that had brought me into the mirrorless fold in the first place after more than 40 years with Canon, began to recede from top of mind because nothing in their hybrid lineup, nor anyone else's, came close to what the GH5 gave us that we needed for what we intended to do that year. Unlimited internal recording with no overheating worries up to UHD 4K 60p 8-bit 420, which was the single biggest set of issues for us. Dual card slots for hot swapping cards or backup. This was actually critical too. And optional battery grip for hot swapping batteries. Again, actually turned out to be critical. Class-leading IBIS for B-roll without a tripod, sometimes without a gimbal. Nice weather sealing. A significant bump in EVF to 3.7 million dot, very nicely done, for manual focus when it was required, and occasionally it was. A flippy screen, and good preamps and a nice shoe-mounted dual XLR mic adapter. It offered a whole lot more than that, like DCI 4K 24p, all-I, 10-bit 422 internal, waveforms, optional vlog, that I categorized as nice to have but not necessary. In fact, we started with just Sigma's 30mm f1.4, and it became our daily driver. Over time, however, we came to rely on a pair of zoom lenses, to my surprise, for 100% of our video needs, that DG Vario Summilux, and Leica's DG Vario Elmarit 50 to 200 2.8 to 4, a full-frame equivalent of 100 to 400. They were and remain exceptional optics, an unbeatable package of image quality, build quality, compact dimensions, and price. A G9 subsequently rounded out our kit, first as Claudia's camera for her personal work, and then increasingly for B-roll. But we knew that neither the GH5's nor the G9's video autofocus were as good as Sony's, so we kept our A6300, then later on an A6400, and a few primes around just in case. A number of other interesting things happened along the way between then and now. We added a micro 4/3 coverage Olympus 75mm 1.8 for my portrait work, and a Leica 15 1.7 for my street work, both wonderful for what they do. And as firmware updates for the GH5 and then the G9 continued to improve autofocus performance, the case for keeping money tied up in our Sony gear grew smaller and smaller. Especially since we just don't do sports or wildlife, no need for tracking. And in the real world of portrait work, IAF is a nice to have, but not a need to have. I'll let you think about that last one for a bit. In the end, this pretty much meant we were holding on to the Sony for gimbal shots or the very occasional 3-camera setups. But the IBIS in the G9 in particular was so good, and the limitations of it at the same time so serendipitously consonant with our aesthetic preferences or narrative intent, that the A6400 and the gimbal began to gather dust. When the pandemic hit and ended the need for even 2-camera setups, the Sony's future became clear. It would take a couple of more years, but by the end of 2020, we had transitioned out of Sony altogether. We did keep our Weeble S just in case. It is amazing with the G9, and there are times when there are no substitutes. Meanwhile, Beginning back in late 2018, Claudia and I began to accelerate our transition to Leica for our personal street work. It had begun for me that year with a TL2, returning to the brand years after selling my M8. Between 2019 and 2021, we completed the transition. I switched out my TL2 for a CL, better EVF for manually focusing M-glass, but once Claudia borrowed the CL, there was no way of getting it back from her. Those of you who know us know this story. I acquired an SL2, and now, between the two of us, as I'm recording this video, we own 8 L-mount primes, all but 2 full-frame, and 2 full-frame M-mount manual focus primes, the 10 of them evenly split between Leica and Sigma. Though at any point in time, we usually have some Lumix glass in-house, and I have to say, they are always the fastest and quietest for autofocus. They usually suffer less from focus breathing, and some of them, like the little 85 1.8S 16 to 35 f4 and 24 to 72.8 S Pros, are really tasty. The thing of it is, through the pandemic, our Leicas have given us everything we want for our personal work: image quality, reliability, functionality, inspiration, and joy. And up until the pandemic, our Panasonic Micro Four Thirds kit gave us everything we needed for video. It remained the most cost-effective, futz-free system out there. And video autofocus wasn't an issue for us. It was either fit for purpose, or we simply didn't use it. For our documentary interviews and YouTube talking head segments, it was the latter, but it was easy enough. I'd use the Image app, arguably the best of its kind out there, and with a simple tap on my iPhone for initial focus, combined with an aperture large enough to blur inconvenient backgrounds, but small enough to keep in focus the narrow range of motion I or our interviewees usually needed, we were good to go. Like right now. This was one of those times when Micro Four Thirds deeper depth of field for a given aperture worked to our advantage. I'd typically shoot at f2.2 or so, the full-frame depth of field equivalent of f4.5. High ISO noise was never an issue because we lit. Though, of course, I kept my movements quite limited, as I'm doing right now, and there were times when, especially shooting interviews on location, being able to shoot with a shallower depth of field would have made things easier. But we survived through advanced scouting and choosing our angles and distances carefully. Since I couldn't rely on the GH5 to handle rapid switching between my face and a piece of gear I might want to show off in front of it for our YouTube videos, let me look around. I chose instead either to hold whatever I wanted to show at eye level, left or right of my face, at the same plane of focus as my face. Did that work? Yeah, it did. Or shoot B-roll for product close-ups, where I also didn't need autofocus. Very workable. And back then, not suboptimal either. The separate B-roll gave us nice production value, and whack-a-mole show and tell has never been my thing anyway. It was all good. Time marches on. But even in 2018, none of the full-frame cameras from Sony, nor any of the other full-frame cameras that began to appear that year from pretty much everyone else, convinced me that we needed anything from them for our video. Neither did Fujifilm's APS-C XH1. I saw no reason to incur the expense and or weight of a different system, nor to give up the other advantages we already enjoyed. But a number of things changed in the year leading up to and then during the pandemic. First, sponsorships grew, and suddenly the number of videos we had to produce each month on deadline grew. The extra hours I'd been able to take previously for B-roll began to weigh me down and stress me out, especially because I no longer had the recovery time between videos, no time for passion projects. For the first time, I could see the advantage of what I'll call bulletproof video autofocus. The possibility of reducing the need for separate B-roll just by allowing me to show what I was talking about during my talking head segments. Or, if I did go with separate B-roll, it could happen with fewer takes and no stress. Turns out a flippy screen from 5 feet away might be okay for framing, but at least I can't tell if I'm in focus once I start moving. Neither is lining up framing and focusing with the app, but then placing your iPhone out of frame and being unable to see it. Second, our ambitions grew. We began injecting much more dynamism into our work, with B-roll shot on the streets of New York and in the subways below, or out on the boardwalks of Coney Island. We had been using a G9 for this purpose because of its ability to record 4K 60p internally, like the GH5, with better IBIS and autofocus than the GH5. But we were still doing multiple takes more often than not because of the autofocus. And on location in bright sunlight, just trying to frame with a little flippy screen was not sufficient, let alone check focus in real time. This caused both of us stress because Claudia is our camera and gimbal op. I could see the advantage of bulletproof autofocus again. Third, video streaming became important. Once the lockdowns began, organizations began to reach out to us about doing live Zoom presentations. This became a fun new revenue stream for us. More importantly, our video mentoring really took off. Suddenly, multiple live video calls were happening every week, sometimes as many as 3 a day. These were generally not stressful. They were, and usually are, delightful. Everyone I've met so far has been amazing, but I learned that with some cameras, you can't charge while the camera is on, or you can't run a remote app to control the camera while you're sending a signal out to your laptop via HDMI. The really interesting thing is that the more animated I naturally became in a live one-on-one conversation, the more often I'd lean into the screen or get up to grab something to show the person on the other end from one of my shelves. And that began to stress me out too, because the autofocus on the GH5 just didn't keep up. It was hit or miss. Mildly entertaining the first couple of times, but then just maddening. All of which is to say that Claudia and I did face real issues. It wasn't all gas, it wasn't all rationalization. The last thing I wanted to do, however, was trade one set of issues for another, or spend a whole pile of money for issues, one issue basically, I might be able to solve by more modest means. Put differently, we reached a point where I thought our challenge was to find another camera system out there that could do what the GH5 and the glass we had for it could do, and give us brilliant autofocus at somewhere near the price and packaging efficiency. The S5 seemed the obvious starting point. But to my chagrin, neither the S5 nor my own SL2, fabulous for video on its own terms, nor any other camera in the L-mount alliance, made the cut. The S5 with the right lens, I've been using it with the Lumix S85 1.8 in the Batcave as our go-to whenever I'm not testing another camera, does the business when I don't tempt fate with a whack-a-mole show and tell. I mean, sometimes it really is no different than what I'm doing with you with manual focus right now, and even then, if it sees my mouth, no go. It is better than the GH5 with the Variosumlux for talking head segments when it's just me in frame. And it can be shallower, which I sometimes like. Although, guess what? I typically use it between f2.8 and f4, which puts it squarely within the range of the Variosumlux, which I typically use between f2 and f2.5. Effectively, the same or nearly the same depth of field. I prefer using the higher megapixel S1R in the Bat Studio with the 16-35 f4 for B-roll or product stills, and then I am willing to use either our Ninja or our small HD focus when I'm close enough to reach it. Autofocus problems do arise when I'm not, which taken together are a little bit heartbreaking because in my book, this autofocus performance is the only thing keeping the L-mount alliance from becoming a breakaway success. I have experienced no worry autofocus in this scenario with Canon's R6. On a pragmatic level, the S5's autofocus is a disappointment. I suspect we are not simply a free firmware update away from nirvana, though I'd love to be proven wrong. On a personal level, it's disappointing because we love pretty much everything else about the Alliance, and for us, it's unmatched for stills. As I said in my review of the S5, the rate of autofocus improvement within the L-mount Alliance and Panasonic in particular feels like Zeno's paradox. With each firmware update, they seem to halve the distance between where they are and where we want them to be, but at that rate, they will never get there. Sigma's hybrid phase detect AF-equipped FPL is a fascinating departure from its L-mount alliance partners, bravo, but I don't know what it portends for Panasonic or Leica, nor how long it will take for Sigma to figure out how to actually harness that technology. Canon's R5 and R6 didn't make the cut, even though, as I implied just a moment ago, the R6's autofocus is the best I've ever seen, bar none. But both cameras still suffer from recording limits and overheating, and while hooking up our Ninja 5 would solve both of those particular challenges, it would mean a bigger, heavier, and more complicated package on the street, with no satisfactory answer to the 650-gram, 50 to 200 millimeter Vario Elrit. In other words, the Canons offered us more futzing, more schlepping, more worrying. The idea of switching into a system with a floor of 4,800 with just the 24-70, but another 5 large for the twice the weight RF 100 to 500, and then their $2,300 RF 15 to 35 2.8L to match the fields of view we already enjoy? No thanks. Though, to be fair, at that point, an R6-based kit would exceed what we have at the short and long ends, though this does not matter to us at all. Nikon's Z7 series didn't make the cut either, but man, are they close. Same 30-minute recording limit, plus the absence of an answer to the Elmrit 50 to 200, though I have to tell you, Nikon's Nikkor Z 1.8 primes and their 24 to 70 2.8 zoom really do it for me. The Z system continues to intrigue. Sony? It is certainly the case that their $3,500 A7S III can do everything the GH5 can do and more, with vastly superior autofocus. Ditto their $6,500 A1. But I realize I don't know that either one could switch back and forth between my face and whatever I put in front of it for a show and tell. And to match the reach and optical quality of the 10 to 25 and 50 to 200, we'd have to pony up $1,800 for their 24 to 70 2.8 G Master, which I just don't like that much. $2,500 for their 100 to 400 G Master, which I do like very much. And another $900 for their 21.8, which I haven't had in hand. In other words, somewhere between $7,800 and $10,800. Highly performant, absolutely, credit where credit is due. But like the Canons, no thank you. I'm only willing to spend that kind of money on personal gear, because then it's about joy. Of course, your mileage may vary. That's fine, but in this case, it's my money. The really interesting Sony solution might in fact have been their little $700 ZV-1 with its product showcase mode as an adjunct to our GH5 kit. On the one hand, that autofocus mode is precisely what I'm looking for to eliminate having to go down into the Bat Studio for separate B-roll, and has stellar IAF along with USB power for streaming too. But is the image quality from its 1-inch sensor good enough, and depth of field shallow enough for the 99% of my talking head segment that inevitably wouldn't be about whack-a-mole show and tell? Nope. The ZV-1 is disqualified on depth of field alone. The integrated 9.4 to 25.7 millimeter f1.8 to 2.8 is the full-frame focal length depth of field equivalent of, call it, 24 to 70 f5 to f8, which makes it too deep for my taste and the physical arrangement of my shooting setup. Never mind my gut instinct that tells me the body is too small to dump heat efficiently, especially important considering back-to-back hour-long Zoom calls. But I could be wrong about that. What about the A6400 we sold just before the pandemic hit? You know, its IAF definitely worked, but initiating it was a fifth-level pain in the and it didn't consistently handle that whack-a-mole product showcase scenario either. Since we're talking APS-C, what about Fujifilm? I just dropped a video review of their little $850 XE4 a week or two ago. Found out that when I mated it to our 16 to 55 2.8 red badge zoom, I love that lens, the IAF worked quite well for video indeed. Same sensor and processor as their flagship XT4, which means brilliant image quality, but no dual card slots, no battery grip, no dedicated headphone jack, no IBIS, a 30-minute recording limit, and I'd be willing to bet poor heat management. Now that I think about it, I didn't test it precisely for product showcase auto performance either when I had it, though there's nothing to lead me to believe it would work any better than a Sony a6400. So what are we talking about? $850 for Zoom calls just so that I can be my more naturally animated self? I don't know about that. All of which makes the question, what about the more expensive XS10 or XT4, given that they both have the same sensor, processor, and autofocus and don't do a number of things as well as the GH5? Yeah, irrelevant. What about Olympus? I like some of their lenses, and it's interesting in theory. We could still use the glass. But they don't offer a body that doesn't have a 30-minute recording limit. Even if they did, I don't like their bodies as much as I do like Panasonic bodies, and paying between $1,600 and $2,000 for a camera I don't like doesn't make much sense to me. I might feel differently if their phase detect autofocus were bulletproof, but from what I understand, it is not as buttoned up as Sony's or Canon's. Then there's the fact that they're now in the hands of a private equity group with an uncertain future. Finally, there's also the fact that over the last 5 years, I have not once been able to get a demo camera from them. I have never once had them follow up on a trade show contact. Oh well, I vote with my dollars by going elsewhere. All of which leaves us where precisely? You could say nowhere. After going through the twists and turns, I've concluded there is not a single elegant, proven solution for either augmenting or swapping out our Micro Four Thirds kit for another system that can give me the autofocus I want without compromising on the rest of what we can do with what we've already got at anywhere near the price. Which is okay. To quote J.R.R. Tolkien, not all who wander are lost. It just means that, in the end, I'll have to figure out other ways to reduce my stress by taking more deep breaths, longer walks with the pooch, hitting the treadmill more often, which I highly recommend. It helps. The key is finding equanimity in what we can do. I didn't really want to crater my production values, learn a new set of menus, or find the gotchas that exist in every system anyway. I will return to manual focus now that I've figured out how to use the image app with the GH5 during Zoom calls. I will move a 42-inch TV monitor down to the Bat Studio, which will give me greater confidence for confirming focus while shooting when I can't be behind the camera and I can't be close. I don't have to lean into my Zoom calls. I don't have to pull gear from my shelves during our one-on-ones. Which means I won't be stressed about autofocus. I won't be stressed about futzing with autofocus settings. I won't be stressed about trying to find the perfect position for placing something in front of my face so that the autofocus does what I want it to do, and even I have to get my... Forget it. You know what? Works for me. Finally, I will give myself time. I can wait to see what the remainder of the year will bring, especially since, in the meantime, our personal street photography kit feeds and nourishes our souls. Will Leica, Panasonic, or Sigma release firmware updates this year, full frame or crop sensor, that finally close the gap with the best phase detect autofocus systems out there? Will they have a product showcase mode like the little ZV-1? If they do, will I be willing to give up the 50 to 200 for Sigma's 100 to 400, 5 to 6.3? I think I might. Will Sony introduce product showcase mode on a unicorn A7 IV? Their new ultra-compact primes are exciting, but will they deliver a Mark II 24 to 72.8 or an answer to the 50 to 200 Vario Elmarit? If 8K really takes off, do I need an analog to the 50 to 200? What about Nikon? When will they ditch the recording limit? Will Canon? Will they introduce an R6 Mark II without recording limit or heat management worries? Will Fujifilm introduce a no-holds-barred XH2 or, most intriguing, given the 4 years since Panasonic released and we bought a GH5, will Panasonic introduce a G10 or a GH6 with autofocus finally so good that we can just continue to use the glass we have? I don't know. I read the same rumor sites you do, but I'd like that. Though, while I'm waiting to find out, that's exactly what we're going to do anyway. We'll use what we have. Adjusting one's attitude, rearranging some furniture, and both installing and understanding the latest firmware updates can allow one the room to solve the most pressing issues while preserving the option to see how the market plays out over a longer period of time. But let's not end this video talking about gear. Instead, let me wrap this up by offering you the moral of this story, taken pretty much, when you think about it, straight from Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade. Take care to understand what truly motivates your search for the Holy Grail, whatever you think that is, however you define it, and realize, if you can, before you embark on the quest, that the real journey lies within. You know what? There are limits to philosophy. I just picked up an XE4. I have it going into the Ninja, and guess what? Oh yeah. This video was brought to you by Storyblocks. To learn more, visit www.storyblocks.com/Hugh. Thanks, Storyblocks. If you like what you've seen here today, please give a thumbs up, subscribe, join the conversation below, because this is an incredible audience. If you'd like a copy of our Streets of New York, the book, head over to www.3bmep.com/books. If you'd like to schedule a one-on-one video session with me for a portfolio review, explore or hone your artistic voice, select gear, and more, sign up at www.3bmep.com/booking. Finally, consider supporting our work by using our no-cost-to-you affiliate links down below, picking up some official Three Blind Men and an Elephant swag at 3bmep.threadless.com, sending coffee money via PayPal, or best of all, join us as a patron over at Patreon. However you choose to support us, as always, we thank you for it.